Imagine this: you're fast asleep in your bed, the world outside shrouded in the quiet darkness of night. Suddenly, without warning, a shadow slips into your home. It's not just a thief looking for valuables, it's something much worse. A predator with no remorse. A man whose name would soon be whispered in fear across California. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. In the mid 1980s, a chilling wave of terror swept through Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. It wasn't just the brutality of the crimes that sent shivers down people's spines, it was the sheer randomness. Young or old, rich or poor, no one was safe. Ramirez didn't care who you were. He chose his victims at random, making every locked door and every shadow in the corner feel like a threat. For over a year, his name and his heinous acts dominated headlines, leaving law enforcement scrambling and the public paralyzed with fear. But who was the man behind the monster? What drove Richard Ramirez to become the Night Stalker? And how did his chilling reign of terror finally come to an end? In this story, we'll dive deep into the life and crimes of Richard Ramirez, uncovering the horrifying details of his spree and the relentless investigation that ultimately brought him to justice. Prepare yourself because the truth is far darker than you can imagine. Let's begin. To understand the monster, we must look back at the boy. Richard Ramirez was born into a world already tinged with darkness. Raised in El Paso, Texas, his childhood was anything but ordinary. By all accounts, he was a quiet, shy child until the shadows began to creep in. Richard grew up in a family plagued by hardship. His father was a laborer with a violent temper, and home life was chaotic, with frequent outbursts and physical abuse. As a young boy, Richard sought escape wherever he could. Unfortunately, one of those places was in the company of his older cousin Miguel. Miguel wasn't just a family member, he was a decorated Vietnam War veteran. But behind the medals and stories of heroism lay a deeply scarred man. Miguel would share chilling tales of his time in combat, detailing acts of unimaginable cruelty and violence. Worse, he didn't just talk. Miguel showed Richard photographs, graphic images of atrocities committed overseas, including pictures of women Miguel claimed to have assaulted and killed. For a young boy like Richard, these moments became twisted lessons, normalizing violence and feeding a growing fascination with death. Miguel wasn't just a storyteller, he became a mentor of sorts, teaching Richard how to fight and even how to kill. But the most defining moment came when Richard was only a teenager. During one of their many unsettling hangouts, Miguel turned his violent tendencies inward, shooting and killing his own wife in front of Richard. Witnessing such an act at a formative age had a profound and irreversible effect on Richard's psyche. This cocktail of abuse, exposure to violence, and a disturbed role model set the stage for what was to come. The young boy from El Paso would soon transform into a predator who lived for chaos and fear. The question remains, was Richard born evil, or was he molded by the influences around him? As we explore his crimes, you may find yourself questioning whether this was a tragedy of circumstance or something far darker. It began on a warm summer night in Los Angeles. The date was late June in the year 1984. Jenny Vincao, a 79-year-old widow, was at home, likely preparing for bed. She lived alone in a small apartment where she should have been safe. But that night, safety was an illusion. Jenny's home became Richard Ramirez's first known hunting ground. Under the cover of darkness, he entered through an unlocked window. For Ramirez, this wasn't a random choice. He had been watching her, learning her habits, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What followed was an act of unthinkable brutality. Jenny was not only stabbed repeatedly, but her body also bore signs of rage and sadism. Ramirez slashed her throat so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. The scene he left behind was horrifying, a nightmarish tableau that would haunt detectives for years. What made this murder particularly chilling wasn't just the violence, it was the lack of motive. There was no robbery, no apparent personal connection. Jenny was simply chosen because she was vulnerable. Ramirez's thrill came not from gain, but from the act itself, a terrifying insight into the mind of a predator. This crime would later be identified as the beginning of Ramirez's reign of terror. For the Los Angeles Police Department, however, it was initially just another tragic murder in a city already grappling with violence. No one could have known that Jenny Vincau's death was the spark that would ignite one of the most infamous killing sprees in American history. Jenny's family and neighbors were left devastated, their grief compounded by the randomness of the crime. A beloved grandmother, known for her kindness and warmth, had been taken in the most horrific way imaginable. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. Ramirez had tasted blood, and for him, it wasn't enough. This was the first chapter in a story that would plunge an entire city into fear. What would come next was even more brutal and far more terrifying. By the spring of 1985, Richard Ramirez's brutality had evolved into a terrifying pattern. On a fateful night in mid-March, his thirst for violence erupted in a series of attacks that revealed not only his growing confidence, but also his sheer audacity. These were not quiet, calculated crimes, they were bold, chaotic, and designed to instill maximum fear. The evening began in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Rosemead, California. Maria Hernandez, a 22-year-old woman, had just pulled her car into the garage of the townhouse she shared with her roommate Dale Okazaki. As Maria stepped out of her vehicle, she had no idea that Ramirez was lying in wait, ready to strike. Out of the shadows, Ramirez appeared, armed and menacing. He raised his handgun and fired at Maria. In a miraculous stroke of luck, the bullet deflected off the keys Maria instinctively held up in front of her face. Though shaken and injured, she managed to run, leaving Ramirez to enter the house. Inside, Dale Okazaki was completely unaware of the danger approaching. Ramirez found her in the kitchen and, without hesitation, executed her with a single gunshot to the head. This act wasn't about robbery, it was about control, fear, and death. What happened next was both surprising and revealing. As Maria ran, Ramirez decided not to chase her. Instead, he fled the scene himself, slipping into the darkness. For someone who thrived on chaos, this was an unusual move. Perhaps he thought he had done enough to cement terror into his victims and the community. But the night wasn't over. Less than an hour later, Ramirez struck again. He attacked a young woman, Veronica Yu, who was driving in Monterey Park. After forcing her car off the road, he pulled her from the vehicle and shot her twice, killing her instantly. These attacks, occurring within such a short time span, revealed how unrelenting and impulsive Ramirez had become. He no longer cared about avoiding detection. His growing need for violence had overtaken any sense of self-preservation. Witnesses described him as a dark, wiry figure with piercing eyes and a sinister smile, a haunting image that stayed with them long after the attacks. This night of horror wasn't just another chapter in Ramirez's spree. It marked a significant escalation. The randomness of his targets and the ruthlessness of his methods amplified the terror spreading through California. The Night Stalker, as the media would soon dub him, was no longer just a shadow lurking in the darkness, he was now a full-fledged nightmare. The question haunting law enforcement was clear. How do you stop a predator who seems to strike at random, with no pattern, no mercy, and no end in sight? The hunt for Richard Ramirez was now a race against time and lives. The night of late March in 1985 would mark one of the most horrifying chapters in the Night Stalker's reign of terror. Richard Ramirez entered the home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara in Whittier, California, unleashing a level of brutality that shocked even seasoned investigators. Vincent, a retired investment counselor, was 54 years old. His wife, Maxine, was 44. The couple had been enjoying a quiet life together, unaware that they had become the target of a predator. Ramirez broke into their home in the dead of night. As he prowled through the house, Vincent woke, startled by the intruder. Without hesitation, Ramirez shot him in the head, killing him instantly. What happened next was even more horrifying. Maxine, who had heard the commotion, tried to defend herself. She grabbed a shotgun the couple kept in their home, but the weapon was unloaded. Ramirez, enraged by her resistance, overpowered her. He then subjected her to a horrifying ordeal, torturing her before finally killing her. But Ramirez didn't stop there. In a shocking act of depravity, he mutilated Maxine's body, carving an upside-down cross into her flesh. He also gouged out her eyes, taking them with him as a grotesque trophy. The level of violence and the symbolic nature of the mutilation highlighted the dark, satanic undertones that drove Ramirez's crimes. When investigators arrived at the scene, they were met with a horrifying sight. The violence was unparalleled, and the evidence pointed to someone who was not just a killer, but a sadist who thrived on inflicting pain and fear. The Zazara murders marked a significant escalation in Ramirez's brutality, leaving the public and law enforcement reeling. This wasn't just a random killing. It was a declaration, a chilling statement of the Night Stalker's capacity for evil. By the spring of 1985, Richard Ramirez had solidified his status as one of the most terrifying criminals in California's history. His attacks followed a disturbing yet unpredictable pattern: home invasions carried out under the cover of darkness, where he would murder, sexually assault, and rob his victims. What made his crimes even more terrifying was the sheer randomness of his targets. Unlike many serial killers who followed a specific type or profile, Ramirez's victims ranged from young children to elderly couples. He attacked women and men, affluent families, and those struggling to make ends meet. There was no way to predict who he would target next, which left the entire state on edge. His modus operandi was equally unpredictable. In some cases, Ramirez would shoot his victims on sight. In others, he would strangle or bludgeon them to death. He often subjected his victims to psychological torture, forcing them to recite prayers to Satan or mocking their pleas for mercy. What stood out in his pattern was the satanic symbolism he often left behind. Ramirez frequently drew pentagrams at the crime scenes or on the bodies of his victims, further amplifying the sense of dread. For him, the violence wasn't just physical, it was a ritual, a way to spread fear and chaos. As the body count grew, so did the fear. California residents began locking their doors and windows, something many had never done before. Guns sales soared, and people slept with weapons by their beds. The Night Stalker wasn't just a criminal, he was a specter haunting the state. Law enforcement faced immense pressure to catch Ramirez. They had pieced together some clues, including a distinctive shoe print left at several crime scenes. But the lack of a clear pattern or motive made tracking him a monumental challenge. Ramirez's spree wasn't just about killing, it was about domination, chaos, and terror. And as the months went on, it became clear the Night Stalker wasn't slowing down. If anything, he was only becoming more bold and more ruthless. Richard Ramirez wasn't just a murderer. He was a self-proclaimed servant of Satan, and he made sure his crimes reflected his twisted devotion. At several of his crime scenes, Ramirez left behind symbols that would come to define his reign of terror. Pentagrams were his calling card. He etched them on walls, doors, and even the bodies of his victims. This use of satanic imagery wasn't just an expression of his dark beliefs. It was a tool to instill fear. He forced his victims to swear allegiance to Satan and mocked their faith, leaving survivors deeply traumatized and investigators disturbed by the ritualistic elements of his crimes. The media quickly latched onto this aspect of his persona, dubbing him a Satan-worshipping killer. For a society already grappling with the satanic panic of the 1980s, these symbols added an almost supernatural layer to the fear Ramirez inspired. Parents kept children close, pastors delivered sermons about evil in their communities, and people began to see satanic symbols where there were none. The police recognized the importance of this symbolism. It wasn't just a random detail, it was part of Ramirez's identity and a window into his psyche. His belief in Satan wasn't just a justification for his crimes. It was the fuel that drove his escalating brutality. For the public, the pentagrams and satanic overtones made Ramirez seem less like a man and more like an unstoppable force of evil. Fear was his ultimate weapon, and through these symbols, he wielded it masterfully. In the age of sensationalist headlines and 24-hour news cycles, the media became both an asset and a hindrance in the hunt for Richard Ramirez. His crimes were gruesome, random, and filled with shocking details, the perfect ingredients for headlines that sold newspapers and glued viewers to their televisions. It was the media that coined the name Night Stalker, a label that transformed Ramirez from a faceless criminal into a legend of terror. This moniker captured the essence of his crimes, the nocturnal invasions, the horrifying randomness, and the lingering fear he left in his wake. However, the media's obsession with the case came at a cost. Details of the investigation were often leaked, compromising law enforcement's ability to stay one step ahead of Ramirez. In one instance, a critical clue, a shoe print from a rare pair of Avia sneakers, was publicized. This forced Ramirez to dispose of the shoes, robbing investigators of a crucial piece of evidence. The media also amplified public fear, turning Ramirez into a larger-than-life figure. Each report about his satanic rituals, his randomness, and his brutality fueled a collective paranoia. While this kept the public vigilant, it also made the task of law enforcement even more challenging, as thousands of false tips and rumors flooded their phone lines. Despite these drawbacks, the media played a pivotal role in Ramirez's capture. By the end of his spree, his face had been plastered across every newspaper and TV screen in California. The public, terrified yet empowered by the coverage, ultimately became the key to his downfall. Among the devastation and horror left in Ramirez's wake, there were glimmers of strength and resilience. Several of his victims survived, their bravery and quick thinking providing law enforcement with crucial insights into the mind of the Night Stalker. Maria Hernandez, who survived the attack in Rosemead, was one of the first to come forward. Despite the trauma of being shot at point-blank range, Maria provided detectives with a description of her attacker, a tall, wiry man with dark hair and intense eyes. This description would become a cornerstone in identifying Ramirez. Another survivor, a teenage girl whose home Ramirez invaded, displayed remarkable composure. After enduring his threats, she later recalled key details, including his distinctive, rotting teeth, a detail that would later help confirm his identity. The most chilling account came from a young girl who survived a kidnapping. Ramirez had abducted her, driven her to a remote location, and subjected her to hours of torment. Yet, despite her ordeal, the girl managed to remember vital details about his vehicle and even provided a description of his face. These survivors weren't just victims, they were heroes. Their courage under unimaginable circumstances gave law enforcement the tools they needed to hunt down Ramirez. Their accounts also served as a stark reminder of the humanity behind the headlines. They weren't just statistics or stories. They were people who endured unspeakable terror and lived to tell the tale. In the hunt for the Night Stalker, these survivors became an invaluable force, proving that even in the face of evil, resilience and bravery could shine through. As the body count grew and the terror spread, law enforcement faced mounting pressure to catch the man responsible for the horrifying spree. The killings were random, leaving detectives with little to go on, no clear pattern, no recognizable motive. This wasn't just another murder investigation. This was a race against time to stop a monster who seemed to strike without warning or remorse. A dedicated task force was formed, bringing together the best detectives from various law enforcement agencies. The Los Angeles Police Department LAPD and the Sheriff's Office, joined by federal agents, pooled resources and expertise to track down the elusive killer. But the challenges were immense. Crime scenes were gruesome and disturbing, each one offering different clues. Victims had been bludgeoned, shot, or strangled. In some cases, Ramirez had drawn pentagrams or left satanic symbols behind, but these elements were difficult to piece together into a comprehensive profile. As the number of murders mounted, so did the confusion about how to identify the killer. One of the most valuable pieces of evidence came from the shoe prints left at several of the crime scenes. They were unique, unlike any commonly worn shoes. Those prints were from a rare pair of Avia sneakers, a brand not easily found in the market. Investigators believed this could be a breakthrough, but finding the exact model and brand was proving difficult. With every new attack, the clock was ticking louder, but with limited clues, law enforcement felt like they were chasing a ghost. Each failure to catch Ramirez made the terror feel even more palpable. Yet the task force remained relentless. The more the investigation unraveled, the closer they seemed to come to unraveling the mystery, one critical piece at a time. Just when it seemed like the case might go cold, a stroke of luck came in the form of a stolen vehicle. In early August of 1985, a car was found abandoned in a parking lot in a remote area of Los Angeles. Nothing seemed extraordinary at first until detectives discovered a vital clue, a fingerprint on the rearview mirror. At the time, it wasn't enough to make an immediate connection to the Night Stalker. But forensic experts went to work, and after testing the print, something remarkable happened. The fingerprint was a match to someone already known to authorities, a man named Richard Ramirez. It was a breakthrough that stunned the task force. This was the first real lead they had in months. The fingerprint connected Ramirez directly to the stolen car, but it was far more significant than just a piece of physical evidence. It was the key that unlocked everything. Authorities now had a name, but that name was of no use without a face to match. The question remained, who was Richard Ramirez? Was he the killer who had haunted California for over a year? Investigators dug into his background, and what they uncovered only fueled the growing horror. Ramirez was no stranger to the criminal world. His violent past, along with his connection to satanic rituals, painted a disturbing picture of a man capable of unimaginable acts. And now that his identity had been revealed, the hunt was on in earnest. The night of August 31st, 1985 would mark the end of the Night Stalker's reign of terror. But the final chapter of this story wasn't written in some dark alley or hidden corner of California. Instead, it took place in a bustling, crowded neighborhood of East Los Angeles. Ramirez, unaware that his face had now been splashed across every news outlet in the city, wandered through the streets, perhaps thinking he could escape the ever-growing net closing around him. But he didn't anticipate the vigilance of the very public he had terrified for so long. As Ramirez walked through the neighborhood, a group of local residents spotted him. They recognized him immediately from the media coverage. In a moment of sheer bravery, the group confronted Ramirez and physically detained him. The police were quickly alerted, and Ramirez was arrested. The arrest was almost surreal. After over a year of fear, a single act of public vigilance had ended the terror. When Ramirez was brought into custody, his cold, emotionless expression was the last thing that many would see of the monster who had haunted their lives. This was the end of his reign of terror. No longer would the people of California lie awake, afraid of who might be lurking in the darkness. Richard Ramirez was in custody, and the nightmare was over. But for the families of his victims, the trauma remained, and justice had only just begun. Ramirez's arrest didn't just signify the capture of a killer, it represented the collective power of the community to overcome fear and fight back against evil. The story of the Night Stalker may have ended that day, but its impact would be felt for years to come. After Richard Ramirez's arrest, the next phase of the nightmare began, the trial. In the summer of 1988, the courtrooms in Los Angeles were filled with a mix of anticipation, horror, and a sense of grim justice as the Night Stalker faced his fate. The case had already been consuming public attention for years, and now the courtroom would become the stage for a final reckoning. The jury selection process was intense. Given the widespread media coverage of Ramirez's crimes, it was difficult to find jurors who weren't already biased or influenced by the constant reporting. It seemed like everyone had an opinion on the case, and many jurors had been exposed to the sensational headlines and TV specials. Ramirez's behavior throughout the trial was chilling. He arrived in court every day with a smug expression, often flashing satanic hand signs, much to the horror of those around him. His defiant demeanor unnerved many, and his actions were deliberate. Ramirez seemed to relish the attention, feeding off the fear he had instilled in the public. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution was ready, and the world watched as the infamous killer was finally held accountable for the terror he had unleashed. For many, the trial marked the end of an era of fear, but it also opened up old wounds for the families of the victims who would have to relive the horrors their loved ones faced. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the staggering evidence that tied Richard Ramirez to the string of brutal murders and attacks that had devastated California. The case against him was overwhelming, built on both physical evidence and the chilling testimonies of survivors. One of the strongest pieces of evidence came from forensic analysis. DNA evidence from several of the crime scenes confirmed Ramirez's involvement in multiple murders and assaults. Additionally, fingerprints recovered from the stolen car he had abandoned matched those of the defendant, providing a concrete link to the crimes. Eyewitness testimonies played a pivotal role as well. Several survivors had managed to provide haunting descriptions of their attacker descriptions that aligned with Ramirez's physical appearance. One of the most chilling was from a woman who had survived his assault. Her ability to recall his intense gaze and the eerie calm with which he carried out his crimes brought the horror of the events to life in the courtroom. Further complicating the defense's case was Ramirez's prior criminal record. It was revealed that he had been involved in multiple petty crimes before the killings began, showing a clear pattern of lawlessness. His known connections to satanic rituals, which he had proudly declared in interviews and through his actions, further solidified the prosecution's case that his motivations were not those of a common criminal, but that of a sadistic killer driven by dark and dangerous beliefs. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of a man who was both methodical and random in his terror, a killer who didn't care about wealth, status, or motive. He cared only about his insatiable thirst for violence. And in this trial, they were determined to make sure he paid for every life he had taken. Despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, Richard Ramirez's defense team did everything they could to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Their approach was to challenge the credibility of the evidence and the reliability of the eyewitnesses. First, they attempted to discredit the forensic evidence. They argued that the DNA analysis was flawed or inconclusive, though these claims were ultimately dismissed by the court. The defense also tried to suggest that the fingerprint found in the stolen car could have been planted or was simply coincidental, another attempt to undermine the chain of evidence. The defense also raised doubts about the eyewitness identifications. With Ramirez being a public figure due to the media coverage, they suggested that the survivors and witnesses might have been influenced by the barrage of information in the press, making their memories less reliable. However, this strategy fell flat when witnesses confidently identified him, recounting his distinct features and his unnerving presence during their ordeals. In another attempt to deflect blame, the defense leaned on the argument that Ramirez was not in control of his actions due to his mental state. They suggested that his exposure to violence as a child and his belief in satanic influences had warped his mind, leading him to commit these horrific acts. While this strategy might have gained some sympathy, it did little to absolve him of responsibility for his actions. Ramirez himself didn't help his defense. His repeated outbursts in court, including his satanic gestures and statements, only reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as a remorseless killer. The defense was fighting an uphill battle, one that seemed almost impossible given the weight of the evidence against their client. Despite their efforts, it became clear that their strategy was a long shot, and that Ramirez's fate was all but sealed. After weeks of intense courtroom drama, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The jury, having been exposed to the chilling details of Richard Ramirez's crimes, began their deliberations. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA matches, eyewitness testimonies, the satanic symbols left at crime scenes all painted a clear and undeniable picture of a ruthless killer. As the hours dragged on, the jury wrestled with the gravity of the decision they had to make. Ramirez's crimes were not just murders, they were brutal, senseless acts of violence that had terrorized an entire state. The deliberation was tense, but in the end, it was clear that the weight of his actions had left no room for doubt. The verdict came down on September 20th, 1989. Richard Ramirez was convicted on all counts: 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The jury found him guilty of a spree that had shattered the lives of countless victims. When the verdict was read aloud, Ramirez remained cold and emotionless, staring forward as if the judgment meant nothing to him. It was the victims' families, however, who felt the full impact of this moment. For them, the conviction was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing their loved ones would never be erased. With the conviction behind him, the trial moved to the sentencing phase. Richard Ramirez faced the death penalty, a fitting punishment for the scale of his crimes. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the families of his victims spoke out, some directly addressing Ramirez with statements of anger, pain, and sorrow. When the moment came for Ramirez to speak, he did so with the same defiant arrogance he had shown throughout the trial. "I am the chosen one," he declared, proudly reaffirming his belief in Satan. He showed no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. His words only solidified the public's view of him as a man devoid of humanity, lost in his own delusions. On November 7, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Ramirez did little more than smirk, showing no sign of fear or regret. For the victims' families, the sentencing was both a moment of closure and a reminder of the devastation they had endured. The aftermath of Ramirez's sentencing brought mixed emotions. While the families of his victims felt some relief, the public's obsession with his case didn't wane. The media continued to follow his every move, and many wondered how someone so evil could still walk the earth, waiting for death. Richard Ramirez's time on death row at San Quentin State Prison was marked by continued defiance and strange behavior. While many death row inmates spent their time in isolation, Ramirez's presence was one that captivated the public. He was seen as a celebrity, albeit a dark one, and his notoriety only grew during his time behind bars. Ramirez's interactions with other inmates were marked by his refusal to show any remorse. He continued to flaunt his satanic beliefs, drawing pentagrams on his prison walls and declaring that he had been chosen by Satan to carry out his work. Despite his conviction, Ramirez received fan mail from admirers who, for reasons unknown, worshipped him. He was even married in prison to a woman who had become infatuated with him, a woman who claimed to understand and support his actions. While awaiting his execution, Ramirez filed numerous appeals in an attempt to overturn his conviction. His legal team argued that his trial had been unfair and that he had been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. However, these appeals were consistently denied. As the years passed, it became evident that Ramirez had become a relic of a bygone era, a man consumed by delusion, locked away in a cage that would ultimately be his tomb. Despite his infamous status, public interest in Ramirez's case remained intense. Documentaries, books, and media coverage continued to pour out, feeding the public's obsession with the man behind the terror. Yet, for those who had lived through his reign of fear, Ramirez's name would forever represent more than just the evil he had unleashed. It would symbolize the long, painful journey toward justice. Ramirez's death came not at the hands of the state, but from complications related to B-cell lymphoma on June 7, 2013. He died at the age of 53, still holding onto his dark beliefs. For many, the story of the Night Stalker had ended, But for the victims and their families, the scars would never truly heal. The legacy of Richard Ramirez was one of horror, infamy, and the relentless search for justice that ultimately brought him to his final end. Richard Ramirez's life came to a final, anticlimactic end on June 7, 2013, when he died from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 years old, and his death was a far cry from the dramatic and terrifying figure he had once been. In the end, it was not the execution that took him, but a disease that claimed his life quietly within the walls of San Quentin State Prison. His death did not bring the same sense of justice that his trial had, and for many it seemed almost fitting that the Night Stalker died far from the limelight, away from the fear he had once instilled in so many. Yet Ramirez's legacy has endured in ways that are hard to ignore. His crimes have become a part of American crime lore, forever etched into the minds of those who lived through his reign of terror. The chilling nature of his spree, his apparent disregard for human life, and the satanic symbolism that accompanied his acts have made him a figure of both fascination and horror. Pop culture has not let the Night Stalker fade into history. Documentaries, books, and even movies have kept his story alive, reminding society of the darkness that once gripped California. Ramirez became a symbol of fear for an entire generation, and his crimes continue to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement to better understand the mind of a serial killer. But for the families of his victims, the legacy of Richard Ramirez is not one of fame or notoriety. It's one of grief, trauma, and the pain of lost loved ones. For them, his death was only a small chapter in the long road to healing, a reminder that the real cost of his actions can never truly be measured. The case of Richard Ramirez is not just a story of horror. It is also a story of progress and lessons learned. The investigation into his crimes marked a turning point for law enforcement in how they handled serial killers and the technology they used to track them down. One of the most significant advancements came in the field of forensic science. The use of DNA evidence, which played a pivotal role in Ramirez's conviction, had been a relatively new tool for investigators at the time. It demonstrated the importance of science in solving crimes and changed the way future investigations would be conducted. The success of the Night Stalker case showed that even the most brutal and chaotic of killers could eventually be caught through careful forensic work and dedication. But beyond the science, Ramirez's case highlighted the importance of community vigilance. For over a year, the people of California lived in fear, and it was the collective awareness and cooperation of the public that eventually led to his capture. The neighborhood residents who spotted Ramirez in East Los Angeles, recognizing him from the media and taking action to detain him, showed the power of an engaged and alert community. Their courage was pivotal in bringing the nightmare to an end. In the end, the legacy of Richard Ramirez is not just one of evil, it is a reminder of the critical importance of justice, the relentless pursuit of truth, and the need for vigilance in our communities. His crimes shook the very foundations of public safety, but through the tireless efforts of law enforcement and the bravery of survivors and witnesses, justice was ultimately served. As we reflect on this case, we must remain vigilant, always ready to protect our communities from those who seek to do harm. The lessons of the Night Stalker serve as a reminder that we must never let fear control us, and that even in the darkest of times, the pursuit of justice can shine through. The story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, has gripped us with its horror and its lessons. But it's not just about the past, it's about the future. We all have a role to play in keeping our communities safe. Stay informed, stay aware, and never ignore the signs. If you found this story chilling and important, be sure to subscribe to Crime Pulse Stories for more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and join us as we continue to uncover the stories that matter. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe justice was served, or is there more to this case that still needs to be explored?